Let's get an analysis on this with William Lawrence. He's a professor of political science and international affairs at American University. He joins us now live from Washington. Thank you very much, Professor, for being with us here on TRT World. Now, I think the big question is, why now? What's the strategic assessment behind restricting Russia's land access to Kaliningrad?
It's the next logical step as Russia continues to threaten Eastern European countries that are either members of the EU and NATO or aspiring members. Your map was slightly deceptive in the sense that Belarus is more or less a vassal state of Russia now. So the gap that we're talking about is just a short 70-kilometer gap that has only been operating since slightly before Lithuania joined these Western organizations in 2004. And that's subject to international agreements, but then those themselves are subject to international sanctions. Personally, I think it's a good thing, not because I think that the war needs to be escalated, but that since Russia sees this conflict, Putin sees this conflict as a war with NATO, we might as well have NATO begin to delimit the borders of what's tolerable sooner rather than later. And that includes both this 70-kilometer gap and the area around Odessa, which needs to have NATO involvement to create a humanitarian corridor to get wheat out. So it's time for NATO to step up and start drawing red lines around Russia and not be subject to this nuclear blackmail, which has kept them at somewhat of a distance.
Talking about the red line, Professor, on the ground, though, what is the red line for Russian aggression that would be sufficient enough for NATO to trigger Article 5?
Well, if Russia moves into this area, then that triggers Article 5, no questions asked. Although there's some gray area, this corridor is not quite as complex as the straits in Turkey, but it has some complexity. As you know, Turkey has had to honor its agreements with Russia, its international agreements under the Montreux Convention, and sort of a day-to-day, week-to-week reassessment of those in light of, Russian ships passing through both ways. What do you do if it's a Russian ship carrying wheat? What do you do if it's a Russian ship carrying stolen wheat? What do you do if it's a Russian ship returning home, which is okay under international law? And although the law governing this gap is not exactly the same, similar types of complexities are involved because the EU doesn't have a right to starve out or besiege Kaliningrad, but it does have a right to enforce sanctions. So this will be both a matter of international law and of international negotiation, with Article 5 looming in the background.
Now, Professor, it is clear that there has been a strategic assessment of Russia's capabilities in a scenario where Article 5 would be triggered. So such a scenario would have been wargamed by NATO allies for every possible outcome. So tell me, what, according to you, may have been the tipping point for NATO commanders to be confident enough to restrict Russian access to Kaliningrad?
Well, I'm not subject to those war games, although I've not only participated in many, but I've designed many. So I know exactly how it's gamed out and what types of things come into the strategic thinking. But I would say it's not that something changed in the NATO calculations. It's that we're in this middle point in the Ukrainian war where it has to be clearer in the Western signaling to Russia that the cost of continuing this war and saber rattling to Ukraine's neighbors is a higher cost than if NATO does nothing. So I think the strategy here is to accelerate the process towards an earlier end to this war, which has a devastating effect on the global economy, on global food security, et cetera, et cetera. And the way to get to a faster ending is to pose costs on Putin, and this is a cost.
Now, Professor, before I let you go, a question which many are wondering at this point: is NATO ready for a multi-theater conflict with Russia?
Absolutely. U.S. troops have been deployed since months before the conflict. The U.S. Surveillance has been going on an active basis. As you have reported a little bit with my assistance, the U.S. was involved in addressing Russian warships in the Black Sea. And of course, the amount of NATO weapons coming into Ukraine is almost unprecedented. So NATO is deeply implicated here. And I think it's probably time that with all of that force in the area, ready to fight if necessary, that some red lines get drawn. Again, not to escalate the war, but to play this dangerous game of brinksmanship towards bringing the war to an earlier end.
Professor William Lawrence, it's always a pleasure talking to you, sir. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.